feeling, for example, pleasure or pain in the moment, right here. So if you stub your toe in the moment and you can feel the pain, and then the thought arises, this is pain in the moment. Now, that means that the concept has seen the present moment and has recognized the concept as a description of what is here in the present moment. So as it gets experienced and the matching concept comes in, that's where we understand more deeply what the concept is really pointing to. So if you're contemplating the pleasures and pain of the flow of life, and the flow of life is all, you might not need to wait until you stub your toe. You might be able to smell a rose and realize, as you're smelling the rose, this is pleasure in the moment, until a bee stings you on the nose, and then there's pain in the moment. So the teachings are pointing to the present moment. And so in contemplation, not all of the thinking should be limited to the head, but rather our intellectualizing, our understanding of the concepts, our understanding of how they fit into the overall framework from time to time very much has to investigate your own life experience and put a tick next to each concept and many ticks next to a concept. Once we have confirmed it as being a valid description of our own life experience, the more ticks we put next to a concept based on confirming it, the more deeply ingrained it becomes, and the less conceptual and the more known. And that's a very important quality of the deepening of the intellectual understanding. So the understanding as described in this teaching has to start off as an intellectual understanding. So a teaching will say something to us. It will describe something. And you might hear it and have no idea what it's saying. So, if it was said in a different language, you've heard it, but you have no capacity to grasp what is said intellectually because the words are not understood by yourself, so you can't comprehend the conceptual construction or the content of the concept. It doesn't even need to be in a foreign language. It could be using words you don't understand in English, or you might have been thinking about something else and you didn't grasp what it says conceptually. If, on the other hand, you've heard what it says conceptually, like, for example, what we're really looking for is peace of mind and not pleasure. Pleasure is pleasure, it's momentary, and it won't deliver us the happiness that we're really looking for. And most human beings are designed such that they are completely convinced that happiness will come when their circumstance improves. So everything I've said there in the last 2 minutes, you can press rewind and listen to it again, is basically a concept that says what we're looking for is peace of mind and happiness. Also, peace of mind is happiness. Happiness is not to be found in pleasure, and yet most people think that their happiness will be found in pleasure. Now, that's a concept, and someone can say, I understand what you have said intellectually. So there's nothing in what you have described that I haven't been able to understand. I know all the words, it makes sense. And they might say, but that's not my experience. I can't confirm it beyond intellectually understanding. I don't know that to be let's say, the case, or true. Let's use the word true. However, as they investigate the concept, which means contemplate the concept, repeat it to themselves, and become clear on what it is saying intellectually, and then start observing, for example, that yes, in this moment, there is a belief that winning this business contract will give me happiness. And so if the person sees their attachment to winning the contract, believing it will give them happiness, losing the contract and feeling this sense of uncomfortableness on the level of oneself because the contract has been lost, and they might recognize, there is what is being described as my deep attachment, belief, assumption that my happiness would have been delivered by the winning of the contract. Now, let's not pretend that the winning of the contract has no effect. The winning of the contract, if it delivered, let's say, a financial benefit, can be seen as a pleasurable outcome, pleasure in the moment. So more finances. So you could say financial pleasure in the moment. It could be that the contract ends up being financial pain. You might think it's going to be profitable, and then something goes wrong and it actually costs you money. And if that's the case, then your hope that it was going to be financial pleasure in the moment turns out that it is financial pain in the moment. Now, there is a difference between financial pleasure and financial pain, just like physical pleasure and physical pain. If we had the choice, if we were in control, then we would obviously pick pleasure over pain. However, the pleasure over pain is picked not because it will actually give us happiness, but because it will give us pleasure. And the body will naturally gravitate towards pleasure because of its biological preferences. So because it has biological preferences, which are different to the attachment to outcomes that I was talking about before, because it has biological preference, it will move away from pain and towards pleasure when available. However, the psychological sense of self that is attached to pleasure, thinking that pleasure will deliver happiness, that is different to the biological preference, and it falls more into the category of psychological identity, me, the thinking mind. And that's the suffering. So the body with its biological preferences will always move towards pleasure and away from pain. The psychological me will be convinced that pleasure is where their happiness is to be found. So as this is seen by someone who is now contemplating the pointers, the spiritual teachings, the understanding can go deeper and deeper and deeper, meaning that the intellectual understanding is becoming total understanding, where it's no longer a concept. It's I see. Yes, I see that there is a deeply ingrained belief that my happiness will be found in financial pleasure. So that part of the concept gets ticked off. We might get financial pleasure, and then we realize that this hasn't delivered me some ongoing happiness for the rest of my life. We might see that it did deliver improvements in life on a circumstantial pleasure level. We can put a tick to that, but it didn't deliver the happiness I thought it would deliver. So then we put another tick next to it, a tick next to the part that says, but it won't deliver ongoing happiness. And as that is seen over and over and over again for many, many different pleasures, the understanding starts going deeper and deeper and deeper. Now, at some point in our life, we didn't know what our name was. And we would, I mean, the process of this is, I'll use it as a metaphor, as an example. It's not exactly right, because as a young child, our intellect isn't really that developed. But let's say someone came along and said, your name is Roger. And they explain what a name is. Say that's a label by which this body-mind organism gets known and referred to. And so whenever anyone calls your name, which is Roger, it means they want to talk to you. And they are addressing you. And the person goes, oh, this is an interesting concept. I'm glad I've heard and learned about names. So they say, I understand the concept that you're describing. And then, a couple of hours later, someone calls their name, Roger. And Roger just keeps on doing what they're doing. And then the person, Roger, and no response. And then the person that explained about names comes up and says, hey, Roger, don't you remember my explanation about names? That your name is Roger, and when someone calls Roger, means they're referring to you. And you go, yes, I understand. I remember. He said, but the guy's been calling you for the last hour and you haven't responded. You go, oh, really? Oh, I didn't hear him. The reality is that the understanding that your name is Roger, or that my name is Roger, was intellectual and it wasn't total. And in time, the understanding that my name is Roger becomes deeply ingrained, such that I don't even have to think about it. So I don't hear. So at first, as it's becoming total, I will hear the name Roger and then go, oh, Roger is my name. That means someone wants to talk to me. And then yes, how can I help you? And so at that point, we can see that the intellectual understanding is there, but it's not fully integrated into our system. At some point, we find that the response is automatic. And that means that the understanding has become total. And you could say it is no longer intellectual. On the other hand, you can say, well, the understanding your name is Roger is actually intellectual, but very deeply ingrained now, such that it is automatic and spontaneous. And so the example also that is used, or the metaphor that's used, is knowing that you're home. When you come to your house, you don't need someone to tell you that you're in your house. You don't need to remind yourself, oh, this is my house. You know intuitively, you recognize everything of the house. So you just know that I'm home. And that you can see in both situations has happened because there's a familiarity with being in your home. You go there every day and it looks the same and you remember the features. And so then there is at a certain point, if you were to see flicking through a book and you see pictures, you go, oh, that's my home. And the same with your name. And the same happens with an understanding about life, such that when it's complete and total, it doesn't feel like an intellectual understanding. And when it doesn't feel like an intellectual understanding, we might think that it has nothing to do with the intellect. However, what we might not appreciate is that total intellectual understanding was very much a process of observing life in a particular way, thinking about life, changing beliefs, having insights and clicks about why certain things happen and having an explanation for why certain things happen, instead of maybe the old explanation that we come to see as being naive, maybe. And as the old explanation falls away because we have a new explanation, and we think about it when we see events from different circumstances or many different events, and we see the dynamics that we've now come to at first understand intellectually, and we see them over and over again. Without us knowing, what's happening is our whole system is rewiring. So as we are coming to know life differently, know ourselves differently, what we have at the moment, or before the seeking really starts making a difference, is we have a deeply ingrained knowing of ourselves. But that knowing is based on a set of beliefs, a set of interpretations of life that happen to be quite misguided. And they were put in place at a very young age because of the society that we grow up in, the attitudes and priorities and ideas about life that our parents have, that our teachers had, and the fact that life is experienced a certain way, that objects in the world are picked up by the senses more or less in the same way by everyone. And it creates an impression of the world, and it creates an impression of how things happen. And that impression is based on a surface interpretation of how things happen, and we have no reason really to dive deeper. And so that interpretation gets put in place. And it happens to be quite a, surface interpretation of things, which means it turns out there's a lot more happening beneath the surface than is evident on the surface. And so once we start diving beneath the surface, but once we start thinking about dynamics that we could in fact spend a whole lifetime not thinking about, we start to get an appreciation of life that is different to what gets set in place. And that appreciation deepens, uproots the old way of seeing it, and then a new way of seeing it kicks in. For a while, that new way is in process, and the old way isn't completely kicked out. And so we have an oscillating between the old and the new. And the old tends to be this sense of self where we feel very much separate. We know ourselves only as the physical, a disconnection to the part of ourself that is less tangible, more formless, so the consciousness aspect. And when that happens, there is more attachment to outcomes, more investment in outcomes, and feeling life is very personal. And that's where all the suffering in life arises. So there's an oscillating between the two. And as we start to connect to the part of ourself that is what we could call ever-present, exists underneath the stream of thought-based identity, and start to rest and ground ourselves in that aspect of the human being, then the effects of this attachment and this taking life very personally start to get weakened, and we start to feel that there is a different potential of being in life. What we find is our identity, our wiring as a person, as a human being, is starting to change. And that change is very much a result of information, new information that has come into our system, has been understood intellectually, and a thinking process, an investigation process has happened. And that thinking process, investigation process has revealed aspects of life, dynamics of life that we hadn't seen before, especially, just to give you an example of what I mean by dynamics of life, we start to maybe appreciate the impersonal unfolding of events that had never been treated as impersonal unfoldings, and rather taken to be something that the myself or the other made happen. And an example of this would be, a tree branch falling and denting your car, for example. It's very much something that just happened as a result of, we could explain it according to the laws of physics. The tree was old, or it had termites, it was a windy day, and the wind put enough pressure on the branch that the branch broke off. The force of gravity pulled the branch to the ground, and your car just happened to be under there, and it then meant pressure on the metal, which has bent the metal. And all of that is just a happening according to the laws of physics. And the fact that your car happened to be under the tree, the fact that the termites had got into the tree and the wind was a certain way, is all not attributable to an individual agent, but rather all a result of very impersonal movement of what I'm describing as laws of physics at the moment. And as we start to look more closely, we might start to appreciate that the functioning of the human being is also very much governed by laws of physics or cosmic laws. We could just say cosmic laws. And those movements that we have been convinced are very personal start to be seen as much less personal. Now, there's a phenomena that needs to be appreciated, and the phenomena is that sometimes things feel very different to how they actually are. And we often take feeling or experience to be a representation of truth. And one of the rules that we have to remember is that feelings, experience, is a subjective thing. And it's not something absolute. And just like our thoughts, we might have a thought about, I don't know, what time the bus comes. And we might be convinced that it comes at 10 to 11 in the morning. And in fact, it might be 10 to 10. And in our head, we're convinced it's 10 to 11. And we'll be absolutely sure, and then we'll find out we're wrong. So just like thoughts can be wrong, feelings about things can be wrong. And yet the thought feels very true, and a feeling feels very true. So you could have what we might call an intuition about something, and it feels like, yes, this is what I need to do. And then in hindsight, we see, that feeling was not a representation of truth. It was fallible. And unless we've got this rule and start thinking about it, that feelings are not a representation of truth, we can get lost in defending a concept that we have about something, a concept that has been put in place because that's how it felt. And as long as we don't question that what we feel may not be the truth, we'll be adamant about a concept. So an example of this is that the process that I spoke about, where the intellectual understanding starts going deeper and deeper and deeper by repetition, that process may not be evident, might not be evident that that's what's happening. And so then at a certain point, the process has had its effect. And then something happens. Let's say the baby starts talking. And when the baby talks for the first time, they're not familiar with why they're talking. They don't know why that's happened or how it's happened. And what they have is the experience of speaking. And when they go to let's say they could think about it, if we went to the experience, we might describe it as this sound just came out of me. And so that's how we'll describe it, because that's how it feels. And the feeling may not at all represent how or why these things happen. And if we go with the feeling and say that the feeling tells me how it is, we might miss something. So let's use another example that's more understandable maybe. The sun appears to rise and set. Now, if we go on the how it feels, how it's experienced, it makes sense that we say the sun rises and it sets. And so in practical terms, we have to continue saying the sun rises and it sets. I'm not suggesting that we need to now start boycotting the description that says, oh, I watched an amazing sunrise or an amazing sunset. In practical terms, I think that's how we need to refer to life, because that's how it appears. And yet in our head, if we understand that this is the paradox, this is what we need to be able to have flexibility with and understand, that I understand that it appears like the sun rises and sets, but I know that in fact, or at least from the conventional wisdom, is that the sun doesn't move and the earth is what is moving in such a way that makes it appear like the sun rises and sets. And so if we can hold that understanding about the dynamic of the sun and the earth position relative to each other, we can continue to say the sun rises and sets. And we can also understand what is really happening and why it happens. Now, sometimes we will, in this process of understanding the paradox, we will realize that the sun doesn't actually move and start boycotting our own description of the sun rising and setting. And that's just part of the process of introducing something new, introducing something that didn't have space before. And it's very important. This is what often doesn't happen in a lot of spiritual seeking, because it needs to. We need to sort of swing to the other extreme and say, no, the sun doesn't move. I'm not going to say the sun rises and sets. That would be ignorance, is what we, because we've always believed it to be absolutely the way it appears. And so now we say, oh, I'm not going to get caught in ignorance anymore. I'm seeking truth. So now I'm going to say, there is no such thing as sunrise and sunset. There is earth moving. And so we boycott describing sunrise and sunset. And at some point, we start realizing that that is creating a disconnection from the practical experience. And then the two get integrated. And when the two are integrated, we have no problem talking about sunrise and sunset. In fact, in practical terms, that is a more accurate description. And yet at the same time, if someone were to come and say to you, hey, do you know that the sun doesn't rise and doesn't set? You go, absolutely, I know that. And they might say, well, why do you call it a sunrise? You say, because it's a paradox that it's both. In practical terms, I'm seeing it from the perspective of someone on the earth. And so relative to the perceiver, the sun rises and sets. And yet I'm not ignorant of the deeper workings. And so it's very important not to hang on to one or the other, but to be able to hold the things and see them in this holistic manner. So our understanding of life not being personal, or not being the doer, or not being attached to outcomes, knowing that my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. When it is total, it's seen very much as, and felt, should I say, it's felt very much as not an intellectual understanding, depending on how we're using the word intellectual understanding. So most things in life we understand intellectually. We don't, we haven't spent sufficient time in relation to a lot of things, understanding it deeply enough that it goes beyond an intellectual understanding. So many things that we talk about, we know intellectually and can have a conversation about it, but it hasn't become deeply, deeply ingrained part about ourselves, or deeply ingrained part of us. And so there is a very specific sense about when we know something intellectually, because essentially there's a narrative. We're thinking about it and talking about it and thinking about it and talking about it. Some things, like your name, you do know beyond what the common description of an intellectual understanding will be. And then you find that you respond automatically. Even if someone calls your name in a distance, you turn. Whereas if you don't know your name deeply, so if you've pretended to be someone else and you've taken on a new name for the day, and you tell the attendant, oh, my name is John. And he says, oh, nice to meet you, John. And you think that went well. I convinced him. My name is John. And then he calls John. You are not likely to turn, like if he calls your name 5 minutes later, John, because it hasn't been deeply ingrained into you that you're John, because you're just using a false name. And so a lot of, if a teacher is teaching, or if a seeker has gone through a significant amount of process, they'll say, oh, this is not about any change that has happened on the body-mind level. This is nothing to do with the intellect, because another part of the experience is that there is a distance created between the objects observed and that which is witnessing the object. And it's a tangible change in the quality of where life is seen from. Now, that change happens after a process. Someone might meditate for years, might go through a period of their thoughts getting cut off or abiding in I am. And at some point, there is this, in some ways that it manifests, a shift and suddenly life is seen differently. And we don't understand the process. A lot of times the process isn't described to us. In fact, it's often said that it's got nothing to do with the body. We have to remember our true nature, and just be that, and that everything arises in awareness, and that it doesn't follow causality. And so when this shift happens, it's all held within that framework that has all of those concepts, where we're not thinking about causal explanations. We're not thinking about time. We're not thinking about ourselves as a physical entity. We've been told that what we are is awareness, and awareness is a very special thing that, has omniscient sort of qualities and what have you. And so then there is this sense, and it feels like the feeling, remember, the feeling can feel like, because we're grounded in a way, in a different part of the human being, and there is this sense of awareness, the feeling can be, oh, I am awareness and I am not the body. And because that's what it feels like, and we haven't had an alternative description that we've investigated, the I am awareness belief or concept gets put in place. And until such time as someone says, hey, could it be that there is a person, and that person was shaped a certain way, and then a process happened and the person got reshaped by the process, and the output of the person, which doesn't tell us about the workings of how that output came about. It just feels a certain way. You wake up in the morning and there's the experience of the bedroom, and it doesn't explain or feel like it's got to do with whatever is happening in the background. Could it be that there's a person, they were shaped a certain way and the experience was once one way, and then enough change happened that the experience flipped and is now different? And could it be that the sense of being formless awareness in which everything arises is actually a mode of the person, a changed person? And as we start thinking about it, we might say, wow, why didn't I consider that to be the case? And we'll look at it and we say, of course I didn't consider that to be the case, because the teachings that made the difference, the teachings that helped bring about the shift, didn't talk about me being a person that needs to change, but rather the teaching says you are not the person, you are awareness. And that there is no time, there is no space, there is no causality, everything is spontaneous and fresh. And so that's why we end up with that idea. And it needs life to come in a certain way, deliver new conditioning that says, really, it just needs to deliver something that makes us think. So one of the explanations I put forward here that says a feeling doesn't necessarily tell you the truth. And then I use an example about the sunset and the sunrise, and the feeling experience. The experience is the sunsets and sunrises. It's not telling you the absolute truth. And so when you feel that you are awareness, is that the truth or is that the feeling? And so that example might be enough for someone to go, oh, I've never thought about it that way. And then they might question the I am awareness, which is important. What is very good is has been an awakening to the awareness aspect of the human being. But if one were to go around claiming to be formless awareness and not the body, whereas in fact one is still the body, but the body is now reconfigured in such a way that the experience is different. And it feels different. But so if you go around claiming I am formless awareness, in fact, what you are is a deluded person that has had a shift, that is a very beneficial shift because it's created space, it's created non-identification. What if you can have a person that is not identified with outcomes, not identified with themselves as a separate entity, but rather sees themselves, the body and the thinking and the consciousness, the whole kit and caboodle, as an expression, one of the many expressions of the totality of life. So, what I started off saying is, in the last few satsangs, you've heard me talking about the importance of conditioning, new conditioning, and how it affects the intellect. And I wanted to follow up in this satsang with one of the key points that explains why it may seem like it has nothing to do with the intellect. So talking about how we can define the intellect in quite a narrow way, where it's just the active thinking about something, where we, it's not spontaneous, not deeply known. And so if we have that description of the intellect, then we say, yes, it's got nothing to do with the intellect. However, if we can appreciate that the spontaneous movement, which becomes much more effortless and is therefore much more direct, in a sense, there isn't a gap where who I am has to think about life a certain way and then respond or justify things, but rather it has become so ingrained that there is an automatic response. So an example of this is when we become completely convinced because of a repeated awareness of our own experience, when we become completely convinced that pleasure and pain are a natural flow of each moment of life, that what happens in the moment is not in my control, that pain is a very valid part of the unfolding of the duality of life, pleasure and pain, male and female, health and disease, wealth and poverty. All of these are interconnected opposites. They're part of the duality of life, which is part of the paradox. So we have the non-duality, means that the whole of life is the combination of pleasure and pain. And from one perspective, we can see it from an outside perspective, where it's a bit like a multicolored ball. There is only one ball, but it has many colors. And so when you're looking at the one ball, you don't, seeing the many colors doesn't mean you don't see the ball as a ball. So to appreciate the non-duality of life is to be able to see the whole of the present moment, the pleasure and the pain, the mix of health and disease, wealth and poverty, good deeds and bad deeds, and see that all as the whole, as it's meant to be, as it is, the duality of life, and not become highly polarized and identified with only the good, only the pleasure, which really then means that we're not seeing attitudinally the other half of the whole. And so that creates a separation which really obscures the whole. So holding the duality, the non-dualities, to see the whole and to see the pleasure and pain, and then also acknowledge that there is pain without meaning that the non-dual falls away. So it's about holding both together. I wonder what point I was going to make. So let's see if we go back to the main point. Maybe it's time for a little break. So it starts to appreciate, because they keep observing, following the pointers, that the flow of life is pleasure and pain, and that when pain happens, it's a completely normal part of life. And so what I was speaking with someone recently, and they said, a funny thing happened, that they were driving and they parked their car and they forgot to get a parking ticket. And when they came back, or on their way back to the car, they realized, I didn't get a parking ticket. I didn't buy a parking ticket. So I wonder if I get a fine. And as they got back to the car, they saw the yellow parking fine on their windscreen. And they said, this was proof that the understanding is going deep. Because he said, I couldn't give a damn about the fact that I had a parking ticket. And and then he said, well, let me be more thing. As when I saw the parking ticket, I went, damn. And then realized that he couldn't give a damn, which means, of course, the damn is the biological reaction. Like, it's not your preference to get a parking ticket. So there is a spontaneous, in the moment, biological reaction to pain in the moment. And then straight away, the pain ends and isn't turned into horizontal suffering about blame and shame towards oneself, blame towards the parking inspector and the laws that are, charge people for not following the rules and all of that. And so it's a sign that there's this deep understanding that, yes, these things happen, that it's not an attack on who I am. It's not an attack on my happiness. And so as that goes deep, really deep, it becomes part of who you are. And so then the teacher will say, the thing is that when I'm talking about an understanding that my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life, it can seem like it's intellectual. Or I will describe it as intellectual because I've put out the framework in the way I'm describing today. Whereas another teacher and another teaching, not that they're wrong, but because it's a different emphasis, they're emphasizing different aspects, will say, the understanding is not intellectual. The understanding is, it's unexplainable, they might say. Or the understanding is not an understanding, but it's rather a knowing yourself as that formless awareness. Now, in this teaching, what I would say is the formless awareness is an aspect of the human being, and becoming aware of that and grounding in that and having access to that allows us to step out of the dimension of the thinking that knows ourself only as a psychological identity, believing that my worth and my meaning and purpose will be found when I achieve this. And so we drop out of that and find, I am. This is the purpose of life, to just be, to be connected to myself, to not have this continuous striving for outcomes that we believe will deliver fulfillment. So as we rest in that part of ourselves, we start finding that my happiness isn't dependent on outcomes. It goes deeper and deeper. And then we find situations happen and no response, no psychological involvement, no resistance to life. And if we look at it at how it feels, and this is why peace of mind, which is what we're really looking for, is emphasized. What we're looking for is peace of mind. And peace of mind is not the gaining of anything, but rather the absence of suffering, the non-arising of suffering. So of course it doesn't feel intellectual, because it's simply the non-arising of the old intellect. However, the old intellect no longer arises because new intellect has come in, dissolved the old intellect. And as the new intellect has got to the point where it's dissolved all the old intellect, it's so deep that what we can call the intellectual concept falls away too, or at least it appears to have fallen away. And then we're left with what we might, from one angle, call our true nature, that just isn't affected by pleasure or pain. And all of these descriptions are accurate from the perspective we see them. So we might then get to appreciate, that's why they say it's not intellectual, because their experience, the teacher's experience, the seeker, the one who is now free of suffering, says, I just turn up in life, events happen, and suffering doesn't arise. Life is not taken personally. And they'll say, and it's not intellectual, it's much, much deeper than that. It's because of having grounded into my essence, let's say. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I'll say it that way. It's important to say it that way, just like it's important to say the sun rises. And it's also important to point out that maybe what is described as a change that is not intellectual is actually a process of the mind receiving information, assessing, dropping old ideas, internally wiring is changing such that we are essentially a different structure. And at some point we find that we interpret life from a completely different perspective, and therefore suffering no longer is part of the output. So in conclusion, I'll just talk about two statements. One is where a teacher or teaching will maybe say something along the lines here that I'm not talking to the intellect, I'm talking to your heart, or I'm talking to presence, or I'm talking to I am. And why that is said, I would say, on the one hand, you can say it's not accurate, because whatever the teacher says, even if they say there is no one here to do anything, so stop thinking that you are someone, that's a concept, right? That's a concept that is being delivered to the one hearing it. And if you go beyond certain concepts that stop us from thinking that there is, what's really happening is someone is giving you information and it's being heard. And that information might be that there is no one, so don't think along the lines that there is someone. And then we might stop thinking along the lines that there is someone, but only because we, through our intellect, have heard a concept that says there's no one. So why does the teaching say, I'm not talking to the intellect, I'm talking to your heart, let's say, or to I am, and you don't need to listen to what I'm saying from the intellect? And that's because, once again, I'm as I said at the beginning, often the way we hear things is from the doership that wants to get it intellectually, but not in the intellectual that goes deeper and deeper and deeper, but that reinforces the false sense of self. And so saying that I'm not talking to the intellect is, in a way, instruction to do it differently, to interpret it differently, to be in the space differently. It's giving the person permission to relax. And it's, look, if you don't even listen to the words, that you can just be in the space and the energy will do the work. So that can be a concept that is delivered. And it can disarm the doer. In fact, it's much better to listen from your heart, or meaning don't listen through the intellect. Now you can see maybe why that's so valuable to say, because someone can come in and go, what a relief. I don't even need to do I don't need to do it the way I've always done it in satsang. So come in and you can just relax. Now, the reality is you don't need to listen intently, because the intelligence of the body is such that it's an instrument, and the hearing will still pick up what's going on, even if you're not on your total alert and thinking. In fact, that can create a receptivity. And it can create a receptivity, not of everything that is said, but maybe one thing within a relaxed being in the room, where maybe your attention is more interested in allowing everything and seeing everything arising. I remember when I first went to Ramesh, and he said, "What do you think of the talk?" I don't think he was so happy about this. And the truth was, I was so relaxed in the talk, and I was just looking at the ocean out through the window that was behind him. And I was watching the waves. It was quite a windy day, and there was a lot of white caps on the waves. And I said, to be honest, I've just been watching the waves. And he said, "Oh, well, all right." And wasn't so impressed with that, because the fact is there's so much important information in the talk. And I know I got that while I was watching the waves. I wasn't really just watching the waves. Bits were coming in, because sometimes I would listen and something came in. And it's a much more receptive way for the important things to come in. Now, is it true that they're not talking to the intellect? I would say that the body is still receiving all of the inputs of the environment, and that's being received by the body-mind organism, and it's being processed by the intelligence of the body. So it might not be the intellect that we know as the intellect, but it's being, all teachings are talking to the person. Now, once again, I'm not talking to the person, maybe it's saying I'm not talking to the doer. I'm not telling the doer to go and do anything. And some teachings will actually say all teachings are talking to the doer, because if there wasn't a doer, you wouldn't, as in the belief of a doer, there's no point teaching, because the person would be free. And so there's no teaching required. So we might say we're not talking to the doer, but all the teachings are designed for a system that has the doership in it. So I hope you can maybe be completely confused by now. No, but yes. I think we'll take some questions. Hi, Holger.
Hello, Roger. Hello, Roger.
Hello, hello.
It's so beautiful, so wonderful when you didn't know anymore what to speak and just to pause.
Yes.
The last days, actually the last 24 hours or so, I had a lot of headache. And interestingly, suddenly I had this idea, I could die any minute, any moment. And this was just so weird, because I suddenly felt so attached to my little life. I mean, most of the time I couldn't care less and always wanted to escape or be somewhere else. And this is just kind of weird, but it doesn't bother me in a way. It's just interesting that this comes up. It's maybe just a biological thing.
I guess you would know better than me, but if ordinarily, I think if you feel like, yes, death would be a relief, that's maybe an indication. I don't know. Tell me if I'm right. It's an indication that life can sometimes be quite heavy. And so the idea of death is like a relief from that. So maybe if now you're thinking, no, that's not so good, it might be a sign that things are lightening up. What do you think?
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, yes, things become easier and lighter and quite beautiful. And I'm really grateful for your satsangs. They contribute to this ease and clarity and delight and joy. I mean, it's so simple.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I'm glad to be able to do them. Someone was talking about the current situation. And as you know, there's some groups, some people that are particularly convinced about all sorts of theories that generally fit under the heading of conspiracy theory. Now, what's interesting is that there's so many conspiracy theories that at least some of them have to be, inaccurate, because there are many that even contradict each other. So maybe some of the what are called conspiracy theories might actually be accurate, but at least we have to be open to the fact that a lot of them, or at least some of them, are not accurate. Well, I won't even go into. I won't go into that. But what it does is it starts to get us to contemplate that if even one of these conspiracy theories was correct, wow, life is completely different to what we imagine. And we are potentially in imminent danger from, the group that is got all these ill intentions for humanity, whichever group that is, whether it's the aliens, whether it's the super rich controlling all of humanity, or whatever. Then one of the benefits of this is that it really maybe gets us to consider and I'm not suggesting that we consider it and start freaking out and thinking it is one of these things, because the thing is, it could be none of the things. I mean, my view is I couldn't care less about all of those theories, because thinking about them isn't going to do anything about it. I'll find out which one it is, if any of them, when it happens. But what it does do is it sort of gets you to loosen your mind and think, well, it could be maybe one of these things. Or a meteor could just pop out of nowhere and, bring the end of civilization. Or the earth suddenly cracks open in half. And because, we wake up each morning and everything's relatively in good order, we assume that that's how it will always be. And when you think about it, it might not be. You just wake up one morning and everything is radically different, to the point that you're about to die because of the difference. And so if you think about this and it goes too far, then you're going to go into existential crisis. And that's not what I'm suggesting. But for some people, they'll think about it and start going, actually, life is maybe short, limited. I've heard 2 stories in the last 2 days about youngish people who have died of a heart attack, and they happened to be extremely healthy, sports oriented, very conscious about the food, and they've dropped dead at ages of under 50. And life is potentially short. And so one of the benefits out of all of this upheaval that's going on at the moment is that maybe it gets us to really appreciate that what is life about? If there is another 10 years, 20 years, 2 years, 3 days, whatever it is, what is life? What maybe it changes the priority of how our time is spent or how the thinking happens. And so, yeah, I think our mortality is, if we don't face it, I don't think there's a potential to really appreciate life. So we need to face our mortality. It's really one of the hallmarks of spiritual awakening, is to really realize I am going to die. But in facing our mortality, hopefully the fact that we're going to die becomes completely inconsequential. And so for me, the thought that I may not be at some point really has no there's no psychological me to have an issue with that. Because the way I see life is it's an experience happening. You wake up in the morning and there's the experience. And it's pleasure, it's pain. We've all experienced quite a lot of pleasure, quite a lot of pain. We know what pleasure or pain is. And so even if there's no suffering and there's just peace of mind, pleasure and pain, we start to appreciate that life is the experience arising in consciousness. And each night in deep sleep, the experience falls away. And there's no one there to have any issue with the fact that experience has fallen away. And then we wake up in the morning and there's life again. And so what is life? To me, life is an experience. And it's not meant to be an infinite experience. It's an experience, and experiences like books, like movies, like anything, has to have an end to round it off. And death is the final chapter, as I see it. So if life is an experience, and some people have an experience that is, limited to 8 years, someone dies as a child, someone else dies at the age of 40, someone else dies at the age of 90 or 100. So, okay, the experience is longer in duality, but the fact is that it's more of the same, more or less, more of either pleasure or pain, life circumstance. And at some point we go, well, I've experienced enough pleasures. So I might not have experienced all of the pleasures, but I've experienced enough to know what pleasure is. And it's something that comes in, it's great, it's nice, but it doesn't deliver us more than pleasure. And the same with pain. So even a very painful situation will be there and then it's finished. So you break your leg, it's painful, and then it fades into the past. And the same with, a lot of traumas, unless, of course, it forms a traumatic knot, which then means that the event of the past that was really, really quite short-lived, probably, or at least it's not happening now, keeps getting dragged into the present moment. Well, that's another experience. That means the experience is flavored that way. So the more we can appreciate even the suffering as part of the experience, then we say, well, that's life. Life is the experience. Let's see. I can't escape it. So it's about the experience. And death is the end of the experience. It's the psychological me that thinks about death and creates a whole story about what is going to be left behind, what isn't going to be experienced. With if the psychological me isn't there, we think it's like deep sleep. No, there can't be a problem. So maybe that's how we can appreciate life.
It's beautiful. In the Bible, it says the last enemy to be destroyed is death.
Yes, I'm happy with that.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you so much, Roger. Gratitude, and I leave the stage for some other people. Thank you.
Thank you, Holger. Hi, Himalika.
Hi, sir.
Hello.
Thank you again for doing this. You're amazing. I just love you. Actually, I wanted to ask a question about attachments. Nowadays, I'm having this very you can say a very strong emotion about a person, and even after understanding about the impermanence of things and what all, I just can't escape this emotion. My every move, my every emotion gets influenced by that person's action. And I don't know, there's two people talking inside my body. I don't understand why this is happening. Like, one person is telling another person, the impermanence of things, things don't last and all that, and one person just not accepting. Something is stopping me to fully realize this thing. And because of this, I cannot enjoy any person. Like you said about that sunrise and sunsets, I am just stuck at there, rising and setting. I cannot enjoy the sun.
Yeah. Yeah, these feelings are very powerful. And there isn't someone who is having the experience, but rather the experience and the someone are contained, or the sense of someone is contained in the experience. So when that arises, the attachment arises, it arises out of the structure, your structure. So it could be, if we go to the Indian scriptures type of explanation, it will talk about your makeup, and specifically here we're talking about the vasanas and the samskaras. So that's one way it's described in a fairly impersonal way, that the vasanas and samskaras have been set in place, and when they kick into action, you have this experience you're describing, this craving, this longing, where nothing else seems relevant. And there isn't really much you can do about it from one perspective. We have to surrender to and surrender really means see it as a wave that comes over us or is over us for a certain period of time. And if you feel it, like any form of suffering, so what I describe as attachment to outcome, deeply ingrained belief that your happiness is to be found in pleasure, sounds very conceptual, right? But in practice, what that description is referring to is a feeling that doesn't at all feel like a belief that my happiness is found in outcomes. It doesn't tell us that. We just feel this yearning for the person, let's say. And so when you feel it, it's an energy, you can call it an energy. I'm suggesting that the energy comes from a belief, but the belief the suggestion is not that you change the belief, because as I'm describing it, it's deeply ingrained. It's you could even describe it as karmic, past life experience, and really those concepts are not necessarily truth, but they're really trying to describe our makeup and how we feel in life as being something really out of our control, something inescapable when it arises. Now, that's not to say it won't change over time, but we don't know how it's going to change, if it's going to change, when it's going to change. Listening to satsangs, listening to my very explanation may well be part of change, but we don't know. I don't know whether what I'm going to say will bring about any change. You don't know, but you'll find out. And the finding out or the change, if it happens, is also a result, in a sense. It's no different to the yearning that comes up, which is a result of your current makeup, which includes, your current makeup really means what's there up to now, which, who knows, let's say might go back 20,000 years, which then makes us say, oh, wow, it's much more than what I'm consciously doing, but it's infused with so much that creates this. So humans, as a general rule, have this attachment to outcome, and deeply, one of the deepest attachments to outcome is an attachment to love, meaning we are completely convinced, almost you could say on a cellular level, that's where the identity resides when it's deeply ingrained because of everything that came before. On a cellular level, we really believe that life will one day be okay when I have love. And on a very unconscious level, it might be the love of God, but then it gets projected out. And one of the most obvious sort of settings for love is romantic settings. So it's very easy for us to become attached to romantic love. And it just lends itself to our deeply ingrained identity. And I don't know that I could suggest or should suggest anything more than this explanation, which is an explanation of dynamics. And the purpose of describing all of this is so that hopefully something in your system so your system sort of lets go about how can I change this? How can I do something about this? And rather adopts more of a seeing this in the light of what I've just described. So seeing the yearning as an energy, appreciating it as a feeling, as part of the experience. It's not pleasant, right? But remember, life is not pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. That our destiny includes uncomfortableness, suffering, pain from time to time, and the opposites, periods of peace, periods of pleasure. And so what I'm describing hopefully can create a witnessing, and I'm not even saying that you need to witness, but just a simple appreciation. Oh yes, here is this deeply ingrained uncomfortableness that just arises, sweeps over me. And if that arises, it's more of the attitude of non-doership, because the attitude of non-doership is this recognition, oh yes, this is happening and it's out of my control. It's a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning, which, as I've said, could extend back, who knows, 10,000 years, 20,000 years. And not even who knows, if you look at where human genes have come from, you trace it all the way back to the very beginning. that's the attitude of non-doership, that sort of is resigned. Yes, this is how it is right now. And
Thank
one
you.
last thing I'll add is the truth is that beyond or beneath that feeling, we'll find that we don't need love to be complete. That even though the feeling tells us that the absence of this person is a disaster to who I am, so that's what the feeling tells us. The truth of the matter is that feeling is not the truth. It's there. It is a feeling. It's uncomfortable. I'm not denying that feeling being there, but it isn't a reflection of the truth of who we are and what we need.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. And actually, I really understand this thing, whatever you said, and you make it sound so easy. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Hello, Peter.
Hello. Hi, do you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, good. Yes, hi, Roger. Thank you, as usual. My question, without trying to ramble here, which may be challenging, but I guess it refers to a previous satsang I listened to recently, in which you brought up a metaphor which I found quite intriguing. You talked about, I think this satsang was some time ago, you talked about identifying ghosts, about a metaphor. You talked about, peeking around corners and spying on, quote unquote ghosts. And I guess I wanted to, I assume you were referring to ghosts were a metaphor for, I guess, feelings of blame and guilt, perhaps, or narratives, or, various attachments. And so I guess maybe if you could clarify that, but I guess the follow-up question is, to me, I guess that's what you are referring to when you talk about investigation. And to me, the metaphor was appealing to me, or intriguing, because I find myself often engaged in these kinds of thoughts, or I guess investigations. And often in pertaining to my own relationships. Speaking of relationships and love and attachment to love. And sometimes on one hand, it feels like, oh, I'm investigating this, and it's important to identify these ghosts, so to speak. But then I find it's also sort of, I'm confused about the difference between, or the differentiation between the thinking mind, being engaged in that mode of the thinking mind, and then the investigation. Sorry for the, hopefully you can sort of parse that out and respond somehow.
Sure. So yes,
yeah.
The metaphor I had used, I think, was where someone was given instruction that you're in a house with a lot of ghosts in it, and really what we need you to do is to observe them, and you have to be very quiet, and so just peek in and look at what they're doing, so that you can then pass information on, and you sort of have no other role other than to just observe. And yes, you're right, the ghost, so when you go past the room, it's really an example of a present moment experience, and if you have a certain feeling or thought arising, it's to witness that as if you were outside the door, just peeking in, seeing the ghost. So it sort of makes you an audience rather than a participant.
Got it.
And so, yeah, hopefully you can, that attitude towards your own thoughts and feelings might kick in. And so, the notion that you're just peeking around the door, you don't want to disturb the ghost, means in a way you have to remain on the outside, just an observer. And not even, hopefully it's not even the person doing the observing, but rather silent witnessing kicks in. So the thinking, even thinking about the concepts, needs to come after the seeing, and the seeing is done not through the concepts, if that makes some sense.
I think, so No, sorry. I was just saying. Yeah. So I was. Sounds like you're talking about witnessing, the notion of witnessing something, which is.
And the witnessing tends to, first you need to be delivered a concept that talks about the fact that you have thoughts, for example, and that the thoughts come and they go, and they're not what you are. They can be seen from outside. So first there needs to be that conditioning that is received by the intellect. And at some point we find that once thoughts are seen, then it becomes a much more silent witnessing, because you don't need to keep thinking about witnessing the thoughts, because the description of the concept has already got you to now be able to see thoughts and feelings arising. And so then it can become much more silent seeing, which doesn't seem like it's got much to do with the thinking and the intellect. Now, where this often gets interfered with, where it doesn't happen that way, is that if something is described as not ideal, our attachment to pleasure and aversion to pain, and the fact we take things personally, is often to do something about something that's not ideal. And just a derivation of what I'm describing is, so if someone does some work and I've asked, I'm really not so interested in blaming and making it personal. I'm just saying, well, the bricks are crooked. Mm-hmm. We're going to have to do something about it. So it's just a statement of fact, more or less. Mm-hmm. Now, if someone hears that statement of fact, what often will happen, they'll go into a big defense, mode. Mm-hmm. And I might say, you're misunderstanding me. I didn't say it as an attack on you as a person. You're taking it that way because of this deeply ingrained, personal identity. Mm-hmm. And it's inevitable that that's going to happen. But the fact is that it was just a description. Now, the bricks are crooked. I can't tell you that you've done a great job, or I could, but the fact is that they're crooked. Mm-hmm. And this movement of our identity to push away pain, which we take very personally, and crave pleasure, which we also take personally, that tends to get infused into the seeking. And so if I describe the ghosts as a disturbance on our peace of mind, mm-hmm. and what we're really looking for is peace of mind, mm-hmm. what we're really looking for in life is peace of mind, and the thinking mind is a disturbance of our peace of mind. That peace of mind is the absence, the non-arising of suffering. Mm-hmm. Now, that's just a description, right? I'm not telling anyone to insist on peace of mind, to resist those things that disturb peace of mind, because that would be less peace of mind and more suffering. But inevitably, when we hear that what we're really looking for is peace of mind, attachment to outcome says, great, thank you for telling me what I should be attached to. And we then told suffering arises and it disturbs our peace of mind. And then they say, great, thank you for telling me what I have to get rid of. And that's very different. When that happens, that's sort of like the person in the house seeing the ghosts and then deciding that they've got to go and shoo the ghosts out of the room and clear the room so that there's no ghosts.
Right.
And it's like, no. Remember, you're just an observer. Your mission isn't to. But then say, but you told me the ghosts were bringing down the value of the property or whatever. Yeah, I know, but we're going to deal with that differently, and your job is to observe them, not to do anything about them.
Right.
And often we go into seeking automatically with this craving for peace of mind and attitude, I am the one that is going to make it happen by stopping the suffering, for example. And ironically, the dissolving of the doership and attachment to outcome starts when, that attitude towards the seeking becomes one of allowing it to happen rather than forcing it to, unfold according to your agenda.
Right. Okay. Yeah. That's very helpful. It sounds like it's sort of, because I guess sometimes I interpret, for example, when you're talking about the idea of, once you start noticing that you're engaged in thinking mind activity, you talk about, stop, invite that, bringing that intention. And so, which has actually proved fairly, useful for me in some ways. But I guess there's a time, I guess it's what you're talking about when you're, when you mentioned spying on ghosts and without scaring them away, it's sort of a lighter touch. I guess it's the sort of difference between analytical thinking and just witnessing, I guess that's the distinction that I'm not struggling with. It's too strong of a word, but just trying to, is that sort of, because the analytical mind is sort of taking these stories or narratives or ghosts and trying to sort of figure them out.
There is a benefit in the figuring out happening, but that's the crucial thing is that so it's like when you're looking at the ghost and you've seen enough ghosts and then it suddenly clicks. Oh. And so that thought has just happened as a result of observing enough of the ghosts and at the same time clicking or realizing, they're always near a PowerPoint. Then once that thought has arisen, you then continue to observe the ghosts. And sure enough, each time you check, is there a PowerPoint next to them? And there it is. So you then, another thought then happens. I wonder if they're fed by the electrical energy in the house. And so those thoughts can arise, but they sort of arise as a consequence of what you're silently observing. And so you can see, well, I didn't really create the recognition they are always near PowerPoints. It required history to drag that out of me. And the history was the observing. And sure enough, one fine day, it just clicks. The thought is, they're always near the PowerPoints. Now, whether, when that thought comes up, or if it comes up, if the correlation is seen, you might observe for years and years and years, and that correlation just simply won't be seen. But let's say it is, then, we might tend to think, oh, I saw that. And on the one hand, yes, the thought arose as part of Roger, because Roger was observing, but we also realize an aspect of it is I only had that thought because life put me in the observing position enough times that that thought then arose. So much so that you can say, because then we'll say, oh, but I observed them 20 times, instead of realizing, how easy it would be for life, your experience of life, to include no motivation to be interested in observing the ghosts in the room. And even if you're given the assignment, you might end up not engaging in the assignment. So if we realize, wow, even the very fact that I have a motivation to engage in the assignment is in itself a happening according to, innumerable factors that made me interested. And what I mean by made me interested, there was a motivation, a feeling to be engaged in the project. And it was only after there was a feeling of being interested in being engaged that the correlation was seen and that the thought arose. And so that's where we suddenly go, what I thought was my conclusion, on the one hand, was a conclusion arising out of Roger, but then we also realized that it's far less personal than I think, because of the fact that it was a culmination of so many other things that I wasn't in control of. Mm-hmm. And so that's where hopefully the thinking goes, where it's the thinking sort of just flows out of an awareness that is being guided by the concepts. So the concepts can, while you're witnessing with nothing really to do, just one of the concepts might pop up. Oh, that's pleasure in the moment. And even the concept popping up, you realize that's not me thinking the concept, but rather the concept arising because of my genes and up-to-date conditioning, i.e., you listen to the satsangs and the concept became part of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So seeing it as a much more flowing contemplation and analysis. There is an analysis in it, but it's much more devoid of the me. There's less me psychological in the analysis. And yeah, it's just feels much more like a happening.
Okay, right. Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for dropping in. Yeah. I think we'll take one last question. Thanks, Peter. Hello, Peter.
Okay.
Oh, Peter, that's the same Peter. So.
Oh, sorry. Do
John.
I have to?
Hi, John.
Hello, Roger. I lowered my hand because you've already been going for almost 2 hours. So thank you for taking my question. I was going to ask it next time. It was related to your example of listening to Ramesh and watching the ocean and finding that your attention, my attention when I listen to you sometimes wanders. And then I become anxious and a bit disappointed because I realize that I'm not listening intently enough. So I'm just wanting to check something with you to see if I'm not perhaps adding something fanciful to what you were saying. Because I heard you suggesting that even though one might not pick up on every word or every concept that is being covered, the body somehow is able to pick up what is necessary. And so I've found that, if that is what you were saying, I found that very reassuring, because it means that I can let the body do the job, and I don't have to work so hard at listening to you. Is that where you were?
Yes, indeed. When the doership aspect falls away, we find that there's a great efficiency in the functioning of the body, and so yeah, so much of what we think makes life happen may actually be getting in the way. And we know this is, we've seen very many examples, experiments of subliminal thinking or subliminal influences on our thinking. And that's because the body is picking up things that are in the environment that we're not consciously picking up on. So you'll be shown, I don't know, 5 bananas in a sequence before a question is asked about what's your favorite fruit or what's the first fruit that pops into your head. And the person's written banana down on a piece of paper. And so you then say banana, and they'll say, look what I've got on the piece of paper, banana. So our body is picking up things without us consciously recognizing what's in the environment. And so there's many aspects to this. The truth is that in one satsang where I talk for 2 hours, it would be unrealistic for someone to hear everything I say. And it's not necessary, because if just one topic is heard, let's say I talk about 15 topics. I mean, we only really need to process one topic at a time. It can take weeks for a particular topic to be unpacked in our own thinking. As we, over time, over a few weeks, we'll see that a topic unfolds and unpacks. And after week 2 of thinking about it, not intently, I have to think about it, but it just keeps arising, we realize we understand much more about the topic than before the contemplation about the topic happened. And so there could be, I don't know, hundreds of subtopics within the overall teaching to be considered. And that's why what a lot of feedback is, people say, I listen to the satsang sometimes 1 or 2 a day. I mean, some people might listen to 1 a week or 1 a month, but one of the phenomena that I've seen, and was the case for me, when you have a body of information that has lots of information in it, we keep going back to it because we know that there's more there that we haven't understood. And as we go back, we don't understand the whole. Each time we go back, we understand little bits of the whole. And after 3 years of listening to the satsangs once a week or once a day or whatever, it makes sense that the understanding is going to have deepened compared to someone who listened to a talk once 4 years ago. And so on this note, I often also suggest that people don't be afraid of listening to one talk 20 times. In fact, my seeking was often about reading the same book multiple times, or listening to a satsang over and over. Satsang I listened to when I was seeking, I'd listen to the same one 20, 30 times, because I knew that there's more to be understood. Some of the concepts and how they link together can be, a little complicated, not really complicated. But you need to hear them over and over. And the first time you hear it, you might think it's saying, this. And by the time you've heard it 10 times, you've really understood what it is saying. And I know this sounds a bit different because I'm talking about understanding. But in the same way, if you listen to something 10 times, the bits that you've missed, eventually, all the gaps get filled in. So in a way, there's a trusting, and there needs to be a trusting that let me be more relaxed. In being more relaxed, I'm more open for the one thing that needs to come in. And the fact that you've zoned off for 10 minutes, you might as well say, oh, it wasn't destiny for me to hear any of that. It's not important for me to have heard it, what I zoned off for those 10 minutes. And then you might have the thought, but I think I should listen to this again because I did zone off for 10 minutes. So who knows what was in that 10 minutes? But don't listen to it again forcefully. Just wait for the feeling to come up for you to listen to it again. So yes, a lot of stuff is being picked up by the deeper intelligence of the body. The senses are working all the time in ways we don't even appreciate. So if you walk into a forest 100 times, so you go there each week, your body knows the energy of the forest. And if one day there is a fire, a big forest fire 10 kilometers away that you're not aware of, but the animals maybe are aware of that fire in the distance, and maybe they've left the area, and you walk into the forest and you might think something's different. And it could well be that because your body is a sensitive instrument, it has picked up that, hey, the forest is different. But on a conscious level, you don't know, you can't explain it. So we don't necessarily appreciate the fine tuning of our body. And it goes way beyond our conscious intellect. And an example of this is a baby, that just hears words, and at some point it just starts speaking. And it just shows that, we learn in interesting ways.
Thank you. Yes, I think of late I'm becoming more aware of the importance of the body and letting it help with what sometimes seems to be an intellectual process. So thank you. Yes, very helpful and very reassuring. Thank you, Roger.
You're welcome. So we'll end it here, but on this note, come into the body, because that's where we come into the present moment. That's where you can feel the tension, you can feel the uncomfortableness of the suffering, and then you'll go, that's why it's an uncomfortableness with oneself. You can feel energy, suffering as an energy, as something that just comes over the system. We can, by coming into the body and feeling, we have more capacity to see the present moment as a whole arising within awareness. So it is very important to what we might call drop out of the head into the heart. And in the heart, as this whole satsang has been about, when we drop into the heart, it's not that we're no longer available and the intellect isn't working. It's just a different aspect of the intellect, and the less troublesome aspect. And when we drop out of the troublesome aspect of the intellect, we become much more connected to right here and right now. And that's the teachings are really pointing at what is here now. So coming into the body and feeling is a gateway to presence, really.
Right. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, John.